Hello, everybody. I hope you're doing good and having a great weekend. We are here on September 12th of 2021 in Miami, Florida, and I'm teaching a course called the Survey of the Caribbean. It's a reading survey specifically of the Caribbean, both the Spanish, the French, the British, and the Dutch Caribbean. Not as much the Dutch, mostly the British and French. And I wanted to take a moment to talk about one of our books and kind of give a quick overview. The book is The Caribbean, The Genesis of a Fragmented Nationalism by Franklin W. Knight, who is a Jamaican scholar, a historian. I won't go into his biography, as some of you posted it in your reading responses. He is Jamaican. And he's quite a good historian. First, I want to point out that this book is not fiction. Some of you have a difficulty understanding the difference between a novel, a historical fiction, a work of historical fiction like James Michener's book, The Caribbean, and a historical monograph, that is a historical textbook or study or an analysis that's based on empirical data and information. Franklin Knight's book is the last of these. It's a historical analysis of the social development of the Caribbean island societies based on names, dates, places, change over time, economic factors, and he has a fairly sophisticated sociology analysis included with his historical overview. So please do not call this fiction. Do not call it a novel. It is neither of those. It made me think that some of you maybe are confused with Michener's book, or maybe you didn't read this. There's no fiction in this book. At least, some history, you wonder if there's some imaginative interpretations that are kind of loose with facts and dates, but I don't believe this to be the case with Franklin Knight. So it is a historical text, sometimes called a monograph, meaning a single book on a subject. I want to encourage professional writing. If you're just new in graduate school, there's a tendency to use spoken English or street English, which is very different than professional English. So do not use spoken English. Try to, and I'm going to give you detailed feedback. I'm using a rubric. I'll send it to you. I'll give you chances to rewrite if you're not happy with your score. But please try to get rid of your spoken English as much as possible. Okay. Moving right along. You can guess what Franklin Knight's goal is from his title. The title is The Genesis of a Fragmented Nationalism. So I would say he's asking the question, why is there not a Caribbean nation? Or two or three Caribbean nations, perhaps a Spanish Caribbean nation and an English-speaking Caribbean nation. Instead, there are all these small islands that are separated by distance, by water, often by language, color, religion, even within the same island. Like in the case of Trinidad, it's fragmented between Spanish, French, and English. By religion, it's fragmented between Catholicism, Protestantism, Hinduism, Islam, Afro-diasporan religions. So there's this, he's projecting this idea that there's a high level of fragmentation in Caribbean culture that prevents it from developing a sense of national cohesion or national identity. So that's the sociological axis of his analysis. He's asking why, and he's trying to uncover the reasons. This is why all good research should begin with a good, clear research question. So you can't really research something unless you know what your question is. And then you know what evidence to look for. So one example of this fragmentation in the 1960s was the British Commonwealth Islands, which began separating from Great Britain in the 1960s. And there was an attempt to create the West Indies Federation, which was encouraged by London, the WIF, and it was going to be led by the three powerhouses in the Caribbean, the British powerhouses, which are Trinidad, Barbados, and Jamaica, along with some of the smaller islands that were English-speaking. But it didn't even survive 2 years. It broke up because of this problem that Knight is trying to analyze. There was a inability to create a sense of an Anglo-Caribbean nation with an Anglo-Caribbean identity. Even within Trinidad, it's difficult. There are problems with a national Trinidadian identity. What about Tobago? What about the East Indian population? So this is the problem. Why is it so difficult for Caribbean islands to form cohesive nations? From the posts that I've read, it seems that some of you had a little trouble grasping the distinction between settler societies and exploitation societies. These are sociological types, and this is a sociological method. Knight is a historian, but here he's using a sociological method of analysis that was first developed by Max Weber around 1910 in his book, The Spirit of Capitalism, and what was it? The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and also his other works on the other world religions. He used this sociological types. So you create two ideal types or more, and you compare and analyze the differences between them. That does not mean that either one of the ideal types actually exist in reality. Every real society will be an approximation of one or the other on a continuum, a sliding scale or a continuum. So the two ideal types that he sets up are the settler societies, which are mostly organized around settlers from another continent, mostly from Europe, reproducing their home countries in a new setting. This would be the case of Barbados in the first 30 to 50 years. It was also the case of Cuba after the exploitation and destruction of the indigenous societies. Cuba became a staging area for further Spanish forays into the mainland in Mexico and South America. And during that period, you had a lot of Creole whites living in Cuba, some free people of color, some African slaves, but they mostly were involved in a variety of trades and business and small crafts, raising cattle, raising food to export to the mainland. So it was not characterized how Knight describes the ideal typical features of an exploitation society. It was a settler society, and they reproduced many of the cultural forms, the architecture from Spain in Cuba during that's approximately 2 or 3 centuries of Cuban history. So so these ideal types may not exist in a pure specific example. His basic point is that exploitation societies are almost entirely based on oppression, brutality, abuse of slave labor, forcibly imported from Africa, and these societies became overwhelmingly Afro-Caribbean because the number of African slaves vastly outnumbered the white wealthy elites that were dominating and exploiting them for financial gain. These exploitation societies did nothing to build up the local society in the areas of infrastructure, viable jobs, economic industries, education, etc. They existed only to make vast amounts of wealth and then get out and go back to Europe, regardless of the human cost. This in turn fractured and devastated the populations that were left behind, with no or very limited sense of national identity. Remember, one of the characteristics of an exploitation society is the dominance of a small economic elite over a much larger population of forced laborers, usually distinguished by racial or color differences, ethnic differences. In other words, a system that relies on extreme color-based slavery. And to put it another way, what he's saying is that the legacy of color-based slavery left in its wake economic and social and cultural devastation, and made it harder for these societies to build a strong sense of national identity. So perhaps the most extreme example of an exploitation society would be the French San Domingue on the western end of the island of Hispaniola in 1789. Remember, Hispaniola was the first island where Christopher Columbus established a Spanish colony, and for some time, the Spanish on the eastern end, Santo Domingo, were building a settler society. Now, that's not to say that they didn't exploit the indigenous peoples. They did. In fact, the 1 million or so indigenous peoples that were already there were wiped out through disease and abuse. So a settler society does have exploitation, and an exploitation society does have some elements of settlement. But again, we're talking about two ideal types on a continuum. So if you read C.L.R. James's book, which is coming up in a few weeks, The Black Jacobins, you'll be very impressed at the amazing story of the Haitian Revolution, but you will also become aware of the tremendous, almost insuperable difficulties that Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian people had to overcome in order to build a sense of Haitian nationhood. And one could argue if they were ever actually successful. So C.L.R. James points out in one quote that the black soldiers in Toussaint Louverture's army would rather burn the entire island down than allow themselves to be put back in slavery, and understandably so. At the time of the Haitian Revolution, there were approximately 40,000 white French people, some wealthy, some were les grands blancs, some were les petits blancs. Then there was another 30,000 or so free people of color. And then there was 500,000 African blacks. Some were blacks, African blacks, some were Creole blacks, that is, born in Haiti. 500,000, that's 500,000 black slaves being overseen and managed and exploited by 70,000 elites, half of whom were people of color. That's exactly what he's describing as an exploitation society. It's a misshapen social structure based simply on the desire for to acquire lucrative wealth through human exploitation. So the Toussaint Louverture's armies of black slaves were willing to destroy infrastructure, destroy plantations, if necessary, to get the French to leave, to get the slave owners to go, to get out, to leave them alone, to allow them to stay free. And over a 12-year period, they had to fight the French twice, the French Empire. They had to fight the British Empire over a 6-year period, who was lusting after this potential wealth and wanted to take San Domingue for themselves. And they had to fight off Spain, who wanted to recover the French half of the island. So Toussaint Louverture and an army of potentially 500,000, that includes men and women and children, black slaves, fought off 3 world empires over 12 years and insisted on being free men and women and having an independent country. In that sense, you can imagine they developed a strong sense of nationhood as an African empire, as an African nation, as a free nation, as an independent republic, independent of Europe, because of their victories in the face of adversity. But nevertheless, Franklin Knight would blame many, if not all, of the modern ills of Haiti on its legacy as an extreme exploitation society, or more simply said, as a horrible legacy of slavery and the ensuing bitterness of the European white empires at being shown up and being defeated, and therefore they punished Haiti over the next 50 or 60 years of its independence. This is not to, I've already said this. This is not to say exploitation would never happen in settler societies. They did, especially in the early period, but to a lesser scale in comparison and less economically motivated, perhaps. Remember, the settler society is an ideal type. So is the exploitation society. Perhaps the best example I can think of a that comes close to the ideal type of a settler society would be the Pilgrims and Puritans in Massachusetts, who were determined to rebuild a new society with their own religious freedom and with economic infrastructure, education, and functioning social institutions, in contrast to South Carolina, which was heavily dependent upon slave labor and was a much more extractive economy, and much further along the continuum towards an exploitation society, South Carolina. For the purpose of the Caribbean, a good example of a settler society, I think, would be on the other end of the spectrum from San Domingue would be Cuba and Puerto Rico. Both of them would be examples of settler societies. Although there's obviously exploitation in the beginnings of those societies, and also later on with the African slavery used to produce massive amounts of sugar in the 19th century. Nevertheless, during the long period after the Spaniards began leaving Cuba to go to the mainland because of the discovery of silver mines in Mexico and the conquest of the Aztecs, during a couple centuries, Cuba was a strategic base and also a base of provision of economic products, cattle, raising of crops. This would be during the 16th and 17th centuries into the 18th. Cuba was mostly a settler society with a lot of Creole craftsmen and immigrants, both of white and also people of color. Black slaves in Cuba never outnumbered the white population, which, even though there was a massive amount of sugar production in slavery in the 19th century, the fact that blacks never outnumbered whites tells you something very simple mathematically, that many Cubans were not involved in slave owning, but many Cuban Creoles were involved in small crafts, cultivating crops, raising cattle, many other enterprises that did not involve slavery. And so Cuba built up a settler society. It developed economic industries, educational institutions, architecture in Havana particularly, its own forms of music and dance that were native to Cuba and usually were a combination of European and African contributions. Although there was a heavy influx of African slave labor into the Cuban sugar industry in the 19th century, black slaves never outnumbered Cuban whites, which implies that most white Cubans were living from economic sources independent of slave labor. Another example of a settler society, I think, would be Trinidad. I'm not as familiar with Trinidad. It began as a Spanish settlement and languished over about a couple centuries. Then it was heavily influenced by French immigration, and they came with their slaves. Some of them came from Haiti. It didn't become British until 1797, and so it only has been influenced by the British for 150 years. It was Spanish. I already said that. Although slavery existed in Trinidad, it was never the sole source of economic opportunity. And so you have a more diverse society in Trinidad than you had in Haiti or San Domingue in 1800. Knight does not go into each island to try to classify them as somewhere on this continuum from exploitation to settler. He doesn't try to tell us where Dominica is on that scale, for example, other than his 4 chapters on nation building in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Haiti, and the British Commonwealth Islands, which we'll be reading next week. In general, it seems to me that most Spanish-speaking islands tended towards the settler type, and most British and French islands tended towards the get-rich-quick and get-out exploitation type. So in summary, although there are probably no perfect examples of a settler society, and there are no perfect examples of, I think Haiti, San Domingue comes pretty close to a perfect example of exploitation society. It is a useful typology which allows us to do some analysis of the development of the divergent paths of development of each of these islands. I think what Knight is wanting to say is that the more a particular island society has a heritage that can be described as exploitative, the more fractured its social hierarchy will be, and the more difficult it will be to achieve a strong national consensus or strong national identity or strong national institutions in that society. In other words, the more dependent it was on African slavery, the more challenging it will be its pathway to nationhood, which I think makes intuitive sense. One of the strongest British islands is Barbados, which I don't know if he brings that into his chapter on the British Commonwealth Islands, but the first 50 years of Barbados was as a settler society. So I wonder to what extent that has contributed to the successful development of a strong sense of Bajan or Barbadian national identity. So why is there not, let me back up the previous paragraph. This book is an empirical and factual history. It is not fiction. Names, dates, and places, and it's history because it shows change over time. It has liberal doses of sociological analysis. A lot of that is based on economic factors. It is a tiny bit dense to use as an introductory history of the Caribbean for new college students, but it's excellent for a deeper analysis for the purpose of understanding the tremendous variety, divergences, and differences in the many island cultures. So why is there not a single Caribbean nation? The nation of the Estados Unidos del Caribe, the United States of the Caribbean. Why does that not exist? According to Knight, his answer would be if you start out with two different kinds of societies, settler versus exploitive, speaking four different languages, that is Spanish, English, French, and Dutch, and practice, but there's also Danish at one point in St. Thomas, and practicing at least two different religions, and later on a dozen, counting Protestant nonconformist sects and Afro-diasporan religions, and then the arrival of East Indians, which brings Hinduism. Then you eventually mix together indigenous peoples with Africans and Europeans, and eventually people from Asia, developing oppressive social hierarchies based on skin color. And if you read the chapter from Michener's book on Barbados, you know how, or was it All Saints? Anyway, there's a chapter in Michener that talks about the complex gradations of color and social standing in one of the British islands. So you put all that together, two different kinds of societies, four different languages, half a dozen different religions, 3 or 4 different human demographic groups from around the world, oppressive social hierarchies that are stratified based on skin color. What you get is a cultural mosaic or kaleidoscope that is in no way a melting pot, as we like to think of ourselves in the United States. It's more like a jigsaw puzzle with important pieces missing. So, next week we will talk about nation building from the second half of Knight's book. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time and attention. Onwards and upwards with these books on the Caribbean. Bye.